everyone! Today I've decided to do a video in which I'm kind of discussing the differences between reading in Russian, which is my native language, between reading in English, which is my second language. So, as I said, I am Russian. I came from Russia. I moved to the UK a year and a half ago. The time that I started learning English was in primary school from when I was 7. But up until my university, I didn't really study it properly. So even though that was a long time for me to learn the English language, at school I wouldn't be able to speak it as much or understand it or read in it or anything like that. When I went to university, English wasn't my main thing. We were studying English for 2 years, but it was very basic level again. And then on my 3rd year, I decided that I wanted to learn English a lot deeper. So I went and took some courses of English as well for 3 years. That's when it just kicked off for me. I realized that I really enjoyed learning the English language, and that's when it all started. But at some point again, I felt like it wasn't enough for me to have those lessons 3 times a week, and I felt like it wasn't enough for me to be able to understand English speech or to be able to speak it or to read in English or anything like that. So it was better than it was before, but not enough. So I started learning it myself as well. So I started learning a lot more words. I started listening to different videos. That's when I discovered BookTube, by the way. So I started watching different films with subtitles at first. I was watching different videos. I was listening to music, trying to understand what people were saying. Then I signed up on a website called Interpulse, which is for people who learn languages, and I started having a lot of different friends from all around the world, and that's how my English language became a lot better. Then I met my husband and I moved to the UK. He's English, and everything has changed since then. So basically I was really shy at first. I couldn't speak. I was able to understand everything, and people were saying that my English was good. But since living in the UK for a year and a half, I think my English is much better now. It's still not perfect and I still make mistakes, and sometimes I don't understand some words or something. I think I speak much better now, and I am able to read it much better and understand it much better, and it's not much more stressful now. So now let's get back to the point of, now I've explained to you kind of my story, I will explain it to you how I feel about reading in Russian and how I feel about reading in English. Obviously, it is still much easier for me to read in Russian because it is my native language. I don't need to concentrate as much. It just goes into my mind naturally. Every single word, every single sentence. I read a lot quicker in Russian than I read in English. And I'm not intimidated by reading big books if they are in Russian, because again, I don't need to concentrate or think as much about the meaning of the words because I know them all almost all the time. It's impossible to know every single word in Russian anyway, because there are so many words, but that's obvious. I remember when I just started reading in English, it was really, really difficult. I almost had to look up every single word, and I got confused with the word order, because obviously in Russian and in English there are completely different word orders. In English it's more of a set order, you can't really change it, whilst in Russian it could be almost not a very set, let's say, way of making sentences, if that makes sense. And yes, so when I first started reading in English, it was such a struggle for me. I had to look up a lot of words. I was confused with the word order, so I had to read sentence so many times in order to be able to understand it. Now I obviously don't do that. I got used to it because I'm immersed in the English language environment. Everyone around me speaks English. The TV is in English. All of the music is in English. At work now, everything is in English. I speak English a lot more, so I'm definitely able to understand it a lot more. And since my brain kind of adjusted to the English language, I sometimes find it hard to speak Russian for some reason, but that's a completely different topic. I'm not going to go into that now. But yeah, reading in English is a lot easier now because, like I said, my brain is working in English now. So it is a lot easier, even though sometimes it still could be a bit difficult. I remember at some point when I was learning English, I was reading a book, The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman, and I looked up some words that I didn't know before because I thought it would affect my reading and I wanted to learn new different words. But then at some point I realized that I wasn't enjoying it at all. reading it that way, so I kind of stopped looking up the words and I just decided to continue on with the book without looking up anything. And actually it didn't change anything for me because I was able to understand everything still, and sometimes even if I didn't know the meaning of the word, the context of it kind of gave it away, and I knew what it meant, and it made total sense in my mind, so I didn't need to do that. And so since then I started reading a lot more books in English in order to improve my English language. But now obviously I don't really have much choice if I want to read physical books. Living in England, all of the books pretty much are in English in the bookshops, so I don't have much choice, and it doesn't bother me as much now. And the more I read in English, the easier it became. Russian classics, I would definitely prefer to read in Russian. Obviously that would be the original language, and I definitely don't want to read a translated version in English of a Russian classic. That would just make no sense in my mind. I mean, some people do that, but in my mind it's preferable to me if I read a book in its native language, in its original language. But sometimes though, most of the time when it comes to English classics, I would prefer to read it in Russian again, because the language could be completely different and there could be a lot of words that I've never seen before, and obviously I wouldn't know the meaning of it. Plus the structure of sentences could be a bit different. They use a different language back in, I don't know, several centuries ago, so I would struggle to read a classic, although I haven't tried it for quite a while. Maybe I should try it and see how it works for me now, because the last time I tried to read a classic in English was a few years ago, so maybe I should try and do that again now and see if that makes any difference. But yeah, any classics I prefer to read in Russian because it's a lot easier for me. The language still could be a bit difficult because it's a classic book, but definitely much easier to read it in Russian. Same goes for, that's why I prefer to read children's books or middle grade books or teenage books, because of the simple language. There are a lot less words that I don't know. The language is very simple, it's built very simple. There are big spaces between the words and lines, which makes it a lot easier, and I don't need to concentrate as much. So that's why I prefer to read those books. And when it comes to adult books with small tiny spaces between the lines or with a lot of text on the page, that intimidates me, to be honest. And I kind of noticed that I tend to avoid it all, those books, because obviously I need to concentrate a lot more, and it's just intimidating because I know that it will take me a long time. Plus the language could be very difficult, the words could be very difficult, the ones that I've never seen before, and I'll probably have to look them up in order to understand what's happening. Even probably I don't need to do that, because I remember reading Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Now since I have my bookshelf, I can just pull it out. Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I read it a year ago and I found myself struggling a bit. It took me a very long time to read it, but you can see the font and there are quite a lot of text on the pages, so it took me a very long time. But it is an adult book, and sometimes I found the language a bit difficult. The words were used that I didn't know, but still I didn't really struggle with it. So maybe a year after that, I'm able to read more adult books without actually feeling stressed out by it, that I need to look up the words. Another thing that I noticed is that if I was reading a book before in Russian, a book from a series in Russian, and then I continued reading the series in English, sometimes it makes no sense. Some names of people or names of something else could be changed. Obviously they are changed, they're translated, so it sometimes just makes no sense and I get completely lost in the books. If I was reading books in Russian, I don't like switching in English and the other way around, so if I started a series in one language, I would prefer to continue on in the same language. Otherwise I'll just get confused. Even though I found it with Harry Potter books, I read them in Russian many times, and when I started listening to them in English a couple of years ago, I listened to the 5 books by Stephen Fry. I found it very different. Obviously all of the words that I'm used to, even the names of the houses at Hogwarts, were completely different, so I kind of found myself being a bit lost from time to time. When it comes to listening to audiobooks, it used to be a struggle for me as well. When I was living in Russia, it was very difficult for me because obviously my brain was working in Russian and it was unusual for me to listen to a book in English. Now I'm surrounded by it, it's much easier for me to listen to books in English, but even still, I try to find easier books to listen to, otherwise I just wouldn't enjoy it. I would have to concentrate a lot more, as I was saying before, and I don't want that. It just takes away the enjoyment of the book, of listening to a book. So if I choose a book to listen to, I prefer to do a children's book or a young adult book or something easy to listen to, otherwise I'll just not enjoy it. At least I don't think so. I haven't tried. Maybe I just should try, but it feels like going out of my comfort zone and trying something a bit harder. Maybe I wouldn't even struggle with it, I don't know. So maybe I should try it. Another two differences that I wanted to say about the books themselves. The books in Russia are much cheaper than the books in English. Let's take this example, The Miniaturist. This paperback was £7.99, and in Russia for a hardcover book you would probably pay even less than this amount for a paperback. Obviously paperbacks in the UK, I don't know, it varies really from £12 to £20 depending on the book. In Russia it's much cheaper, and for that you would pay probably, I don't know, £4 maximum for a paperback. But I prefer English covers of books a lot more than the Russian covers, because I don't know why, the English covers seem to be a lot more beautiful, a lot nicer, a lot more colourful, and the Russian books are not quite like that. It feels like they put a lot more effort into it than in Russia. So yeah, that's my experience. If I needed to choose if I prefer to read in Russian or in English, I don't actually know, because there are disadvantages and advantages of both, so I don't actually know which one I would choose. It's definitely much easier to read them in Russian, but at the same time I find now weird reading something in Russian or speaking Russian in the English language environment. So I find it difficult now, so I prefer kind of naturally to read in English because I'm surrounded by it. Does it even make sense? If you want me to make a video on how I find, I don't know, speaking in Russian in England, or how it all goes with the languages to me, I would film it for you. But yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions on anything that I've just mentioned, please leave them in the comments. I would be more than happy to answer them, because I think it's quite an interesting topic and I thought some of you might be interested to know more about that. If you are from a different country, please tell me how you find reading books in a different language. Do you find it hard? Do you find it easy? Thank you for watching. Bye!